The fiddle sang through the near-empty dance hall like a lonesome bird calling across the prairie, and Rosalie Crawford played with her eyes closed, pouring every ounce of her heart into the melody, because there was nobody left to see the tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. It was midnight in Silver Ridge, Montana Territory, in the autumn of 1884, and the Saturday night dance had ended an hour ago. But she could not bring herself to stop playing, could not bear to face the silence of her empty room above the general store where memories of her father's laughter still echoed in every corner. The bow moved across the strings with practiced grace, her calloused fingers finding each note with the certainty born of 15 years of playing, since she had been a girl of 7 learning at her father's knee in their cabin outside of town. The sound of boots on the wooden floor made her open her eyes, and she saw a tall cowboy standing in the doorway, hat in his hands, watching her with an expression she could not quite read in the lamplight. He was perhaps 25 years old, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of summer sky, and there was something in the way he held himself that spoke of long days in the saddle and longer nights under the stars. Rosalie lowered her fiddle slowly, suddenly aware of how she must look with her hair coming loose from its pins, and her simple blue dress wrinkled from the heat of the crowded hall earlier in the evening. "I am sorry," she said, her voice hoarse from disuse. "The dance ended some time ago." "I should have locked the door." "Do not apologize," the cowboy said, stepping further into the room. "That was the most beautiful thing I have heard in a long time, maybe ever." He had a slight drawl that marked him as someone from further south, Texas perhaps, or Oklahoma Territory. "My name is James Thornton. Most folks call me Jamie. Rosalie Crawford." She set her fiddle carefully in its case, her hands trembling slightly. Nobody had complimented her playing in weeks, not since her father had died of pneumonia in early September, leaving her alone in a town where she had always been seen as slightly odd, the bookish girl who preferred music to gossip and solitude to social calls. "I know who you are," Jamie said, and when she looked up sharply, he added quickly, "I have been working at the Double R Ranch since August. I have seen you play at the dances before, but you always leave so quickly afterward that I never had the chance to introduce myself properly." Rosalie felt heat rise to her cheeks. She had been leaving quickly, hurrying back to her room before anyone could offer her false sympathy about her father or, worse, avoid mentioning him at all. "I have responsibilities," she said, which was not entirely untrue. She worked 6 days a week at the general store, keeping the books and helping customers, and her employer, Mrs. Henderson, was kind but exacting. "I came back because I forgot my gloves," Jamie said, holding them up as proof. "But I am glad I did because I wanted to ask you something." He paused, turning the gloves over in his hands, and Rosalie noticed they were well worn but carefully mended, the leather soft with use. "My friend Samuel is getting married in 2 weeks. To Mary Beth Johnson, the school teacher. They are having the wedding here in Silver Ridge, and they have been beside themselves trying to find someone to play music for the ceremony and the celebration afterward. When I heard you playing just now, I thought perhaps you might consider it." The request was so unexpected that Rosalie simply stared at him for a moment. She knew Samuel Garrett by sight, a cheerful young rancher with red hair and freckles, and Mary Beth was a sweet-natured woman who taught the children with patience and genuine affection. "They want me to play at their wedding, if you would be willing," Jamie said. "I know it is short notice, but their original plan fell through. The piano player they had arranged broke his hand last week, and they have been in a panic ever since. Samuel is like a brother to me. We grew up together back in Texas, and when he moved up here to start his ranch, I followed a few months later. I would do just about anything to make sure his wedding day is perfect, and after hearing you play, I think you could make it something truly special." Rosalie thought of her empty days, the way time seemed to drag when she was not working or playing her fiddle. She thought of how her father had always said that music was meant to be shared, that the greatest joy of playing was seeing how it moved other people. "I would be honored," she heard herself say. What sort of music would they like? The smile that broke across Jamie's face was like sunrise, warm and bright and impossible to look away from. Anything you think is fitting. Mary Beth mentioned she has always loved hymns, and Samuel is partial to the old ballads. But honestly, I think they would be happy with whatever you chose to play. He took a step closer, and Rosalie caught the scent of leather and sage and something else, something indefinably masculine that made her pulse quicken. Could I perhaps call on you this week to discuss the details? I know Samuel and Mary Beth would want to meet with you as well to talk about their preferences. That would be acceptable, Rosalie said, trying to keep her voice steady. It had been so long since a man had looked at her with such open admiration, so long since she had felt anything other than grief and loneliness. I work at Henderson's General Store most days. You could find me there. I will come by tomorrow afternoon if that suits you, Jamie said. He settled his hat back on his head and gave her a small bow that was courtly despite his dusty range clothes. Thank you, Miss Crawford. You have just saved my best friend from a considerable amount of worry. After he left, Rosalie stood alone in the dance hall for a long time, her fiddle clutched to her chest, feeling something that might have been hope stirring in her heart for the first time in weeks. She walked back to her room through the quiet streets of Silver Ridge, past the saloons where laughter and piano music still spilled out into the night, past the sheriff's office where a lamp burned in the window, past the church with its white-painted steeple pointing toward the star-scattered sky. Her room was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a washstand and a shelf for her precious books, and she lay awake for hours thinking about blue eyes and a warm smile, and the way Jamie Thornton had looked at her, as though she was something rare and valuable. True to his word, Jamie appeared at the general store the next afternoon, cleaned up and dressed in a fresh shirt with his hair still damp from washing. Mrs. Henderson, a plump woman with sharp eyes and a kind heart, gave Rosalie a meaningful look as she gestured for her to take a break from stocking shelves. They stood outside on the wooden sidewalk, and Jamie explained that Samuel and Mary Beth would like to meet her that evening at the boarding house, where Mary Beth lived with 2 other unmarried women who taught at the school. I could escort you there if you would not mind the company, Jamie said, and there was something almost shy in the way he asked, as though he expected her to refuse. I would appreciate that, Rosalie said. I confess I am a bit nervous. I have played at dances and church services, but never at a wedding. You will be wonderful, Jamie said with complete confidence. I have heard a lot of fiddle players in my time, Miss Crawford, and you have something special, a way of making the music sound like it is telling a story. They talked for a few more minutes before he had to return to the ranch for the afternoon's work, and Rosalie found herself smiling as she went back inside the store. Mrs. Henderson was rearranging a display of fabric bolts, but her eyes twinkled knowingly. That is a fine-looking young man, she said. And I have heard nothing but good reports about him from the other ranchers. Hard worker, honest, does not drink to excess or gamble away his wages. He is just asking me to play at his friend's wedding, Rosalie protested, but she could feel herself blushing. Of course, dear, Mrs. Henderson said placidly. But there is no harm in appreciating a handsome cowboy with good manners, especially one who looks at you like you hung the moon and stars. That evening, Jamie arrived promptly at 6 o'clock to walk Rosalie to the boarding house. She had changed into her best dress, a deep green calico with ivory buttons, and pinned her dark hair up carefully. The autumn air was cool and crisp, smelling of wood smoke and fallen leaves, and the mountains that surrounded Silver Ridge were painted purple and gold by the setting sun. They walked slowly, and Jamie told her about his life, how he had grown up on a small ranch in Texas with 2 older sisters and a younger brother, how he had learned to ride before he could properly walk, how he had followed Samuel north because he had wanted to see new country and maybe, someday, start a ranch of his own. What about you? He asked. Have you always lived in Silver Ridge? Rosalie nodded, her throat tight. My father was the town doctor. He came here in 1869, right after the gold rush brought people flooding into Montana territory. My mother died when I was very young, too young to remember her properly. It was just my father and me for most of my life. She paused, gathering her courage. He died 5 weeks ago, pneumonia. It came on so suddenly, and even though he was a doctor, there was nothing he could do. Nothing I could do. Jamie stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression full of genuine sympathy. I am so sorry, that must have been incredibly difficult. He taught me to play the fiddle, Rosalie said, surprised to find she could talk about it without crying. He said music was the best medicine he knew, that it could heal things that all the tonics and poultices in the world could not touch. He played every evening after supper, and I would sit beside him and learn. Even at the end, when he could barely breathe, he would ask me to play for him. She looked up at Jamie, at his kind eyes and strong features. So when I play now, I feel like he is still with me somehow. Then Samuel and Mary Beth will be honored to have you at their wedding, Jamie said gently, and so am I to have met you. The meeting at the boarding house went well. Samuel Garrett was every bit as cheerful as Rosalie remembered, with an infectious laugh and an easy manner. And Mary Beth was lovely in her happiness, her brown eyes shining as she talked about the wedding. They wanted traditional hymns for the ceremony itself. She explained, perhaps Amazing Grace and Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing, and then livelier music for the dancing afterward. They would be married in the church at 2 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon, with a celebration to follow at the Grange Hall. I cannot thank you enough for agreeing to do this, Mary Beth said, reaching across the table to squeeze Rosalie's hand. I know we have not been close friends, and I regret that. I always admired you from afar, but I was never quite sure how to approach you. You always seemed so self-sufficient, so content in your own company. Rosalie felt a pang of guilt. She knew she had been standoffish over the years, preferring her books and her music to social gatherings, but she had not realized how that might have appeared to others. I would like to be friends, she said impulsively, if you would be willing. I would love that, Mary Beth said warmly, and Rosalie felt something inside her chest loosen, a knot of loneliness she had not even known she was carrying. Over the next 2 weeks, Rosalie saw Jamie nearly every day. He would stop by the general store to give her updates about the wedding preparations, or to ask her opinion on some small detail. And gradually, their conversations expanded beyond the wedding to encompass everything else. He told her about his dreams of someday owning his own land, about the cattle drives he had been on as a younger man, about the time he had nearly been trampled by a spooked horse, and the scar on his shoulder that was a permanent reminder of that particular piece of foolishness. She told him about her favorite books, about the botanical drawings she made in her spare time, about the way Silver Ridge had changed over the years from a rough mining camp to a proper town with families and schools and a future. They went for walks in the evenings after she finished work, strolling along the creek that ran behind the town, or climbing the gentle hill to the east, where they could watch the sunset paint the sky in shades of crimson and amber. Jamie was easy to talk to, with a quick wit and a thoughtful nature that surprised her. She had expected him to be like the other cowboys she knew, rough and loud and more interested in drinking and carousing than serious conversation, but he was different. He asked her questions about her opinions and actually listened to her answers, and he had a way of looking at her that made her feel seen in a way she had not experienced before. One evening, a week before the wedding, they were sitting on a fallen log by the creek, watching the water tumble over smooth stones, and Jamie said quietly, I have to confess something to you, Rosalie. I did not forget my gloves that night at the dance hall. She turned to look at him, surprised. What do you mean? I mean, I went back deliberately, hoping you would still be there. He met her eyes steadily. I had been wanting to talk to you for weeks, but I could never work up the courage. You always seemed so distant, so untouchable. But that night, I heard your music from outside, and something about it just broke my heart open. I stood there in the street for 10 minutes just listening before I finally made myself go inside. Rosalie's breath caught. And the wedding, was that real? Oh, that part was entirely true, Jamie assured her quickly. Samuel and Mary Beth really do need a fiddle player, and you are genuinely saving their celebration. But I will not lie and say I was not also thinking about how it would give me an excuse to spend time with you. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and took her hand in his. His palm was calloused and warm, and his fingers curled around hers with a gentleness that made her heart ache. These past 2 weeks have been the best I have had in a long time, maybe ever. You are unlike anyone I have ever known, Rosalie Crawford. I feel the same way, she whispered. About you, I mean. I did not think I would ever feel this way about anyone. I had resigned myself to being alone. You do not have to be alone, Jamie said. Not if you do not want to be. He leaned in slowly, and Rosalie met him halfway, their lips touching in a kiss that was soft and sweet and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, she was smiling and so was he, and the creek sang its burbling song as darkness fell around them. The day of the wedding dawned clear and beautiful, with the kind of perfect autumn weather that seemed like a blessing from above. Rosalie arrived at the church early, her fiddle case in hand, and found Mary Beth in the small room behind the sanctuary where she was getting ready. She wore a dress of ivory silk that had belonged to her mother, altered to fit her smaller frame, and there were flowers woven into her upswept hair. She looked radiant and nervous in equal measure. You look beautiful, Rosalie said sincerely, and Mary Beth's face lit up with a smile. I am so nervous I feel like I might be sick, Mary Beth admitted. What if I trip walking down the aisle? What if Samuel changes his mind? He will not change his mind, Rosalie assured her. I have seen the way he looks at you. That man is completely besotted. The ceremony was simple and moving, with the minister speaking about love and commitment, and the journey that Samuel and Mary Beth were beginning together. Rosalie played Amazing Grace as Mary Beth walked down the aisle on her father's arm, and she saw the tears in Samuel's eyes as he watched his bride approach. She played through the ceremony, providing soft background music, and then Joyful, Joyful, We Adore Thee as the newly married couple walked back down the aisle together, their faces shining with happiness. At the Grange Hall afterward, Rosalie played for hours as people danced and laughed and celebrated. She played reels and waltzes, ballads and jigs, her fingers flying over the strings until they were sore. Jamie danced with her during the breaks, holding her close as they swayed to music provided by an elderly man with a harmonica, and she felt as though she was floating. You were incredible, he murmured in her ear as they danced. Everyone is talking about how beautiful the music was. I am glad, she said, resting her head against his shoulder. They deserve a perfect day. Later, when the party was winding down and people were beginning to drift home, Samuel and Mary Beth came to find Rosalie. They both hugged her tightly, thanking her over and over for making their wedding so special. You have a true gift, Samuel said earnestly. We will never forget this. Jamie walked Rosalie home through the quiet streets, carrying her fiddle case for her. The night air was cold now, with a hint of the winter that was coming, and she shivered despite her shawl. Without a word, Jamie shrugged out of his coat and draped it around her shoulders, and she pulled it close, breathing in the scent of him. I have been thinking, he said as they reached the general store, where a lamp burned in the window of her upstairs room, about what I want from my life. What would make me happy? And what did you decide? Rosalie asked, though her heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. I decided that I want to build something lasting. A home, a family, a life with someone I care about. He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. I know we have only known each other for 2 weeks, and by all rights I should be more cautious, more practical. But I have never felt this way about anyone before, and I do not want to let it slip away out of fear or foolish pride. Jamie, she breathed, but he pressed on. I am not asking you to marry me tonight, he said quickly. I know that would be too fast, too presumptuous. but I am asking if I can court you properly, with the intention of marriage if we both decide that is what we want. I am asking for the chance to prove to you that I am serious about this, about you." Rosalie felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, happy tears. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I would like that very much." He kissed her again, there on the sidewalk under the stars, and Rosalie thought that perhaps her father had been right about music being medicine, because she felt healed in a way she had not thought possible just a month ago. The courtship that followed was the stuff of fairy tales, at least to Rosalie. Jamie called on her every Sunday afternoon, their one day of rest, and they would walk or ride out into the countryside, exploring the valleys and foothills around Silver Ridge. He borrowed a gentle mare from the ranch for her to ride, and though she was not an experienced horsewoman, she found she loved the freedom of it, the way the wind whipped her hair and the world seemed to open up around her. They talked endlessly, about everything and nothing. Jamie told her about his family back in Texas, how his father had died when he was 16 and he had become the man of the house overnight, responsible for his mother and siblings. How he had worked himself nearly to exhaustion for years, taking any job he could find, until his older sister had married a prosperous shopkeeper and his younger brother had found work on a larger ranch. How he had finally felt free to pursue his own dreams, which had led him north to Montana Territory. Rosalie told him about her childhood, about growing up as the doctor's daughter in a town that was still finding its identity, about the patients who had come to their door at all hours, and how her father had never turned anyone away, even when they could not pay, about the books she had read by lamplight, dreaming of places she would probably never see, about her mother, the bits and pieces she had gleaned from her father's stories, and the one photograph they had, showing a young woman with Rosalie's dark hair and serious eyes. As autumn deepened into early winter, Jamie became a fixture in Rosalie's life. He would stop by the general store on his way back to the ranch in the evenings, just to see her face and exchange a few words. He brought her small gifts, nothing expensive but always thoughtful. A smooth stone from the creek, a cluster of late-blooming wildflowers, a book of poetry that he had ordered special from the catalog. Mrs. Henderson watched their courtship with approval, and the other townspeople gradually warmed to Rosalie in a way they never had before, as though Jamie's affection for her had made her more approachable, more human in their eyes. 6 weeks after the wedding, on a cold November evening, Jamie took Rosalie to dinner at the hotel restaurant, the fanciest establishment in Silver Ridge. They sat at a table by the window, eating roast chicken and potatoes and apple pie and talking about their week. The ranch was preparing for winter, Jamie explained, bringing the cattle down from the high pastures and making sure all the buildings were secure against the storms that would inevitably come. "I spoke to Mr. Reynolds yesterday," Jamie said, referring to the owner of the Double R Ranch. "About my future with the outfit." Rosalie set down her fork, suddenly nervous. "What did he say?" "He offered me a position as foreman starting in January." Jamie's eyes were bright with excitement. "It would mean better wages and more responsibility. And it would mean I could start saving in earnest for my own place." "Jamie, that is wonderful." Rosalie reached across the table to squeeze his hand, genuinely thrilled for him. "It is wonderful," he agreed, "but it is also terrifying because it makes everything feel more real, more possible." He paused, turning her hand over in his so he could trace patterns on her palm with his thumb. "Rosalie, I know we said we would take our time, but I have to tell you that I am already certain I love you. I have loved you since that first night in the dance hall, when you were playing with your eyes closed and your whole heart in the music. I love your intelligence and your kindness and the way you see the world. I love that you listen when I talk about my dreams and that you share yours with me. I love your strength and your vulnerability and everything in between." Rosalie felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but she was smiling through them. "I love you too," she said, her voice shaking. I did not think I could feel this way. I did not think anyone would ever see me the way you do." "I want to marry you," Jamie said. "Not today, not tomorrow, but soon as you are ready. I want to build a life with you, a home where we can fill the rooms with music and laughter. I want to grow old with you, Rosalie Crawford. Will you consider it?" "I do not need to consider it," Rosalie said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, yes, I will marry you, Jamie Thornton." He stood up abruptly, nearly knocking his chair over, and pulled her to her feet. He kissed her right there in the middle of the restaurant, with half the town watching, and Rosalie kissed him back, not caring who saw. There was applause and cheering from the other diners, and when they finally broke apart, both of them were laughing and crying at the same time. They were married in January of 1885, on a clear, cold day when the world seemed to sparkle with frost. Mary Beth stood up with Rosalie as her matron of honor, and Samuel stood up with Jamie, and it felt right and perfect to have them there, the couple whose wedding had brought Rosalie and Jamie together in the first place. Rosalie wore a dress of deep blue wool that Mrs. Henderson had helped her make, and she carried a small bouquet of pine boughs and dried flowers. The church was packed with people, more than Rosalie would have expected, and she realized with a start that she had friends now, a community that cared about her. She had asked Mary Beth to play the fiddle for the ceremony, a passing of the torch that felt symbolic and appropriate. As she walked down the aisle on the arm of Mr. Henderson, who had agreed to stand in for her father, she saw Jamie waiting for her at the altar with tears in his eyes and love written all over his face, and she knew she was making the right choice. The minister spoke about love and partnership, about two people becoming one while still maintaining their individual identities. He spoke about the challenges they would face and the joys they would share, and he urged them to always choose each other, even when it was difficult. When it came time for the vows, Jamie's voice was strong and steady, and Rosalie's was clear despite her nerves. They exchanged simple gold bands that Jamie had bought with his carefully saved wages, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Jamie kissed her with such tenderness that Rosalie felt her heart might burst from happiness. The celebration afterward was held at the Grange Hall, just like Samuel and Mary Beth's wedding. There was food and dancing and laughter, and Rosalie played her fiddle for a while, unable to resist the pull of the music. But mostly she danced with her husband, marveling at how natural it felt to call him that, and accepted congratulations from what seemed like everyone in Silver Ridge. They spent their wedding night at the hotel, in the best room available, and it was awkward and sweet and perfect all at once. Jamie was gentle and patient, and Rosalie felt cherished in a way that made all her nervousness melt away. They talked for hours afterward, curled together under the quilts, making plans and dreaming dreams. "I know we will be living at the ranch in the foreman's cottage for now," Jamie said, stroking her hair, "but it is just the beginning. In a few years, I should have enough saved for a down payment on our own land, maybe something small to start, but it will be ours." "I do not need a big spread," Rosalie said, tracing the line of his jaw with her fingertips. "I just need you, and maybe someday if we are blessed, children." "Children," Jamie repeated, his voice full of wonder, "little ones with your dark hair and my stubborn streak. Teaching them to ride and play the fiddle and be kind to everyone they meet." "That sounds perfect," Rosalie whispered, and kissed him again. The cottage at the Double R Ranch was small but comfortable, with 2 rooms and a loft, a fireplace for warmth, and a view of the mountains that took Rosalie's breath away every morning. She continued working at the general store 3 days a week, and the rest of the time she kept house and played her fiddle and gradually learned the rhythms of ranch life. She learned to cook heartier meals than she had bothered with when she was alone, and she learned to mend clothes and tend a garden and a dozen other skills that made her feel competent and capable. Jamie was busy from dawn to dusk with his new responsibilities, overseeing the ranch hands and managing the cattle and reporting to Mr. Reynolds. But he always came home to her in the evenings, no matter how tired he was, and they would eat together and talk about their days. Sometimes Rosalie would play her fiddle while Jamie did small repairs or read the week-old newspapers that made their way to Silver Ridge. It was a simple life, but it was theirs, and Rosalie was happier than she had ever imagined possible. In March, she realized her monthly courses had not come, and a cautious excitement began to build in her chest. She waited another month to be sure, and then she told Jamie one evening over supper, watching his face as understanding dawned. "A baby," he said, his voice hushed with awe. "We are going to have a baby in the late fall, if my calculations are correct," Rosalie said, and then she was swept up in his arms as he spun her around the small kitchen, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. The pregnancy was not easy. Rosalie was sick for the first few months, barely able to keep anything down, and Jamie hovered over her anxiously until she finally had to tell him to stop treating her like she was made of glass. As the weather warmed and she moved into her second trimester, the sickness faded and was replaced by a sense of well-being and energy that surprised her. She worked at the store until she was too big to comfortably stand for long periods, and then she spent her days at home, sewing baby clothes and preparing the loft as a nursery. Mary Beth visited often, bringing books and gossip and companionship. She was not yet expecting herself, but she and Samuel were hoping it would happen soon. The two women grew close during those long summer months, the kind of friendship that Rosalie had never experienced before. They would sit on the porch of the cottage, snapping beans or mending clothes, and talk about everything under the sun. "I am so glad you married Jamie," Mary Beth said one afternoon. "Not just because you two are perfect together, but also because it means you are my friend now. Truly my friend, not just someone I admire from afar." "I am glad too," Rosalie said, resting a hand on her swollen belly where the baby was kicking energetically. "I spent so many years alone thinking I preferred it that way, but I was wrong. This is so much better." In October, as the leaves turned gold and crimson and the first frost touched the mountain peaks, Rosalie went into labor. It was long and difficult, and there were moments when she was certain she could not do it, when the pain was so overwhelming that she wanted to give up. But Jamie was there, holding her hand and wiping her forehead with a cool cloth, and the midwife was calm and encouraging, and finally, after nearly 20 hours, she heard the sharp cry of a newborn baby. "A boy," the midwife announced, laying the squirming infant on Rosalie's chest. A healthy, strong boy. Rosalie looked down at her son, at his red face and dark hair and tiny fists waving in the air, and she felt a love so fierce and immediate that it took her breath away. Jamie was beside her, tears streaming down his face, and he reached out a tentative finger to touch the baby's hand. The tiny fingers curled around his immediately, and Jamie let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Hello, little one," Rosalie whispered. "We have been waiting for you." They named him Thomas, after Jamie's father, with the middle name of Robert for Rosalie's father. Thomas Robert Thornton. He was a good baby, quiet and content most of the time, and Rosalie marveled at every tiny thing about him. His perfect fingernails, the way he smelled like milk and sunshine, the small sounds he made in his sleep. Jamie was utterly besotted, coming home from work each evening and immediately reaching for his son, holding him and talking to him as though he understood every word. The winter of 1885 was hard, with deep snows and bitter cold that kept them largely confined to the cottage. But Rosalie did not mind. She was warm and safe with her husband and her son, playing soft lullabies on her fiddle while Thomas slept and teaching Jamie the words to the songs her father had taught her. They talked about the future, about the land they would buy and the home they would build, and those dreams sustained them through the long, dark months. In the spring, Mr. Reynolds called Jamie into his office and made him an offer that changed everything. He was getting older, he explained, and his children had no interest in running a ranch. He wanted to sell parcels of his land to men he trusted, men who would care for it and build something lasting. He offered Jamie 500 acres at a price that was more than fair, with generous terms for payment. "It is everything I have been working toward," Jamie told Rosalie that evening, his eyes shining. "Good grazing land, water rights, timber for building. We could start our own herd, build a real house. It would be hard work and we would have to be careful with every penny, but it is possible." "Then we should do it," Rosalie said without hesitation. "We should build our future." Over the next 2 years, they worked harder than Rosalie had ever imagined possible. Jamie hired on seasonal help during the busiest times, but mostly it was just the two of them, building their dream acre by acre. They lived in a simple log cabin that Jamie built with his own hands, 1 room to start with and then 2, and then 3 as they could afford to expand. Rosalie learned to rope and brand cattle, to help with the hay harvest, to do 100 tasks that she had never envisioned for herself. Her hands grew rough and her face tanned, and she found she did not mind. This was her life, the one she had chosen, and she was proud of what they were building together. Thomas grew from a baby into a toddler, and then into a little boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair. He followed Jamie everywhere, determined to help even when his help mostly consisted of getting in the way. Rosalie would watch them together, her heart full, and play her fiddle in the evenings when the work was done, and they could all rest for a few hours before beginning again the next day. In the summer of 1887, Rosalie realized she was pregnant again. This time the sickness was not as severe, and she was able to keep working through most of the pregnancy. Their second child, a daughter they named Margaret Rose after both their mothers, was born in February of 1888 during a howling snowstorm. She was smaller than Thomas had been but just as healthy, with a cap of blonde hair that surprised them both. "She looks like my mother," Jamie said, marveling at his daughter. "I have photographs at home in Texas. The resemblance is remarkable." Life settled into a rhythm after that. The ranch slowly prospered, not making them wealthy but providing enough that they could pay off their debt to Mr. Reynolds ahead of schedule and even hire a full-time ranch hand to help with the work. The cabin grew into a proper house, with glass windows and a real floor and separate bedrooms for the children. Rosalie planted a garden and fruit trees, and she kept chickens for eggs and meat. She played her fiddle at barn dances and church services, and people came from miles around to hear her. Thomas started school when he was 6, riding into town each day with his father who had business at the feed store or the bank. Margaret was a lively, curious child who asked endless questions and followed Rosalie everywhere, chattering constantly. Some days were exhausting, but Rosalie would not have traded them for anything. This was the life she had dreamed of during those long, lonely years after her father died, even though she had not known it at the time. In 1890, when Thomas was 5 and Margaret was 2, Rosalie gave birth to twin boys they named James after their father and Samuel after Jamie's best friend. The twins were a handful from the beginning, always getting into mischief and egging each other on, but they filled the house with laughter and chaos in equal measure. Jamie built onto the house again, adding 2 more bedrooms, and Rosalie sometimes felt like she was running a small boarding school rather than a family home. Samuel and Mary Beth had 3 children of their own by then, and the 2 families grew close, celebrating holidays together and helping each other through the inevitable crises of ranch life. When Samuel lost half his herd to a brutal winter storm, Jamie and Rosalie were there to help him rebuild. When Margaret came down with scarlet fever and Rosalie spent 3 terrified days and nights at her bedside, Mary Beth took the boys and cared for them as though they were her own. The years passed, not always easily but always together. There were droughts and floods, illnesses and accidents, the 1,000 small and large challenges of building a life on the frontier. But there was also joy, so much joy that sometimes Rosalie felt like her heart could not contain it all. The first time Thomas successfully rode a horse by himself. The way Margaret learned to play simple tunes on Rosalie's fiddle, her small fingers clumsy but determined. The twins' 4th birthday, when they managed to get themselves covered head to toe in mud within 5 minutes of putting on their good clothes for the party. In 1895, Rosalie was 30 years old and Jamie was 34, and they stood on the porch of their house one evening watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of rose and gold. The children were all inside, supposedly getting ready for bed, but more likely getting into some form of trouble if the thumping and giggling were any indication. Jamie's arm was around her waist, and she leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his body against hers. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Giving up the idea of a bigger spread, a more prosperous ranch, we could have done more if we had not had so many children so quickly." Jamie turned to look at her, his expression incredulous. "Regret this, regret you and them and everything we have built together." Not for a single second. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle despite the calluses on his palms. "You are everything to me, Rosalie. You and the children. The ranch is just land and cattle. It is a means to an end. But you are the end, the purpose, the reason for all of it. Do not ever doubt that." She kissed him then, putting all her love and gratitude and joy into it, and she felt him smile against her lips. From inside the house came a crash and a wail, and they both sighed and headed inside to investigate, but they were smiling as they did it. This was their life, messy and chaotic and absolutely perfect. When Thomas was 13, he announced that he wanted to be a rancher like his father, and Jamie glowed with pride. When Margaret was 11, she played her first solo at a church service, her mother's fiddle singing in her hands, and half the congregation was in tears by the time she finished. The twins were a whirlwind of energy and mischief, but they were also fiercely loyal to each other and to their family, and they worked hard when work needed to be done. In 1898, Rosalie discovered she was pregnant again, much to her surprise. She had assumed her childbearing years were over, but apparently nature had other ideas. She was 33 and tired from raising 4 active children, but she also felt a quiet excitement at the thought of another baby. This one was easier somehow, perhaps because she knew what to expect, or perhaps because her body had grown accustomed to the process. Their 5th child, another daughter they named Sarah Jane, was born in early 1899. She was a calm, sweet-natured baby who rarely cried and seemed content to simply observe the chaos around her with wide, thoughtful eyes. Margaret was thrilled to have a sister, and she appointed herself as Sarah's guardian and playmate, doting on the baby with an intensity that made Rosalie's heart swell. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, life in Silver Ridge changed and evolved. The town grew larger, with more shops and businesses, and eventually a railroad line that connected them to the wider world. The wild, rough edges of the Montana Territory gradually smoothed out as law and order became more firmly established. Jamie and Rosalie's ranch prospered, not in dramatic fashion but steadily, year after year. They hired more help as the children grew older and started families of their own. Thomas married a rancher's daughter from the next valley over, and they built a house on the far corner of Jamie and Rosalie's property. Margaret married a banker's son and moved to town, but she came to visit every week, often bringing her fiddle to play duets with her mother. The twins went into business together, buying a freight company and running it with the same chaotic energy they had brought to everything else in their lives. And Sarah, the surprise baby, grew into a serious, studious girl who announced at age 10 that she wanted to be a teacher, just like Mrs. Mary Beth Garrett had been before she retired. Jamie's hair went silver at the temples, and then all over, and Rosalie found she loved him even more with each passing year. They had built something together, not just a ranch but a legacy, a family that was rooted in love and hard work and the kind of partnership that only deepened with time. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1905, Jamie gave her a new fiddle custom-made by a craftsman in Helena, with their initials carved into the wood. "I fell in love with you because of your music," he said as she held the beautiful instrument reverently. "And I have stayed in love with you because of everything you are. Thank you for saying yes all those years ago when I was just a cowboy with a lot of dreams and not much else." "You were never just a cowboy," Rosalie said, tears sliding down her face. "You were the man who saw me when I was invisible to everyone else. You were the one who made me believe in second chances and happy endings. I would say yes 1,000 times over." They stood together in the parlor of the house they had built, surrounded by photographs of their children and grandchildren, and Jamie played the harmonica while Rosalie played her new fiddle, creating a simple melody that spoke of love and home and all the years they had shared. Outside, the Montana sky stretched vast and endless above their land, and the mountains stood eternal in the distance, and Rosalie thought about that long-ago night in the dance hall when she had been playing alone, thinking she would always be alone, how wrong she had been. How gloriously, wonderfully wrong. In 1910, when Jamie was 50 and Rosalie was 45, they stood together at Thomas's wedding to his second wife, his first having died in childbirth 3 years earlier. It was a bittersweet occasion, celebrating new love while still mourning the loss of the sweet girl who had been their daughter-in-law. But life went on, as it always did, bringing both sorrow and joy in equal measure. Margaret had 5 children by then, and she brought them all to the ranch every summer to run wild and learn about the land their grandparents had built from nothing. The twins had settled down somewhat, each marrying sensible women who managed to keep them more or less in line. And Sarah, at 11, was already teaching the younger children their letters, a natural educator even at such a young age. Rosalie still played her fiddle nearly every day, finding solace and joy in the music just as she always had. Sometimes Jamie would join her on the harmonica, and they would play together on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over their land. Other times she would play alone, letting the music carry her back to other times, other days. She would think of her father and how proud he would be to see the life she had built. She would think of that night in the dance hall when Jamie had walked in and changed her entire world. She would think of all the moments in between, the small everyday miracles that made up a life well lived. By 1915, they had 14 grandchildren and another on the way. The ranch had expanded to over 1,000 acres, with 3 generations working the land together. Jamie had handed over the day-to-day management to Thomas and his new wife, though he still rode out most days to check on things and offer advice when it was wanted. Rosalie had stepped back from much of the physical labor, but she still kept the books and managed the household, and she played her fiddle at every family gathering, every wedding, every celebration. One evening in late summer, they sat together on the porch swing they had installed the previous year, watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Margaret's oldest was teaching the twins' youngest how to properly throw a rope, and Sarah, now 17 and about to start her teacher training, was reading a story to the littlest ones under the big cottonwood tree. "Did you ever imagine this?" Rosalie asked, leaning her head on Jamie's shoulder. "When we were young and just starting out, did you ever imagine we would have all this?" "I imagined loving you," Jamie said, his arm around her waist. "I imagined building a life together. But this exceeds every dream I ever had." He kissed the top of her head, a gesture so familiar and comfortable that it made her heart ache with tenderness. "You have given me everything, Rosalie, everything that matters." "We gave it to each other," she corrected gently. "That is how partnership works." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the light fade and the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. From inside, the house came the sound of laughter and conversation as the rest of the family prepared supper, and Rosalie felt a profound sense of contentment settle over her. This was her life, her beautiful, imperfect, absolutely perfect life. And it had all started with music, with a fiddle playing in an empty dance hall and a cowboy brave enough to walk through the door. In 1920, they celebrated their 35th wedding anniversary with a party that included nearly 100 people, most of them family. They had survived wars and epidemics, droughts and harsh winters, the death of friends and the joy of new births. They had grown old together, their love deepening and maturing like good wine, becoming richer and more complex with every passing year. Thomas ran the ranch with quiet competence, making changes when they were needed, but always respecting the foundation his parents had built. Margaret had become a well-known musician in her own right, playing fiddle at dances and gatherings throughout the county. The twins' freight business had expanded to 3 different towns, and they were prosperous and respected businessmen, though they still had the same mischievous gleam in their eyes. And Sarah had just accepted a position teaching at the Silver Ridge School, following in the footsteps of the woman who had been her mother's first real friend. Rosalie was 55 now, her dark hair threaded with silver, her hands marked by years of hard work. But her eyes were still bright, and when she picked up her fiddle, the music that poured from it was as beautiful as ever. Jamie was 60, his body showing the wear of decades of physical labor. But he still rode out most days, and he still held Rosalie close every night, and his love for her had never wavered, not even for a moment. On the night of their anniversary, after all the guests had gone home and the house was quiet, they sat together on their bed and looked at each other in the lamplight. They did not need to speak. Everything that needed to be said was there in the way Jamie touched her face, in the way Rosalie leaned into his embrace, in the long, slow kiss they shared. "I would do it all again," Jamie murmured against her hair, "every bit of it exactly the same way." "So would I," Rosalie whispered. "So would I." The years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges, but also unending love. In 1925, they celebrated their 40th anniversary, and Jamie gave Rosalie a locket containing miniature photographs of all their children and grandchildren. She wore it every day after that, close to her heart. In 1930, their 45th anniversary, Rosalie played a special concert at the new community center, and people came from 3 counties to hear her. She was 70 years old, and her fingers were not as nimble as they once were. But the emotion in her playing was deeper and richer than ever before. Jamie sat in the front row, his eyes never leaving her face, and when she finished, he stood and applauded longer than anyone else. They danced together afterward, slowly because his joints ached and her back was not what it used to be, but they danced nonetheless, swaying to music only they could hear. In 1933, as they approached their 50th anniversary, Jamie's health began to fail. He had always been so strong, so vital, that it shocked everyone to see him grow frail and tired. The doctors said his heart was giving out, that there was nothing to be done except to make him comfortable and wait. Rosalie refused to accept it at first, insisting that he would recover, that he was too stubborn to let something like a weak heart defeat him. But as the weeks passed and he grew weaker, she had to face the truth. She moved their bed downstairs to the parlor so he would not have to navigate the stairs, and she sat with him for hours each day, holding his hand and talking about their life together. Sometimes she would play her fiddle for him, soft melodies that spoke of love and memory and all the years they had shared. Jamie would lie there with his eyes closed, a small smile on his face, and Rosalie would watch him and feel her heart breaking. One evening in early autumn, as the leaves were just beginning to turn and the air had that crisp quality that promised winter was coming, Jamie stirred and opened his eyes. Rosalie was dozing in the chair beside his bed, her fiddle in her lap, and she jerked awake at the sound of his voice. "Rosalie," he said, and his voice was weak but clear. "My beautiful Rosalie." "I am here," she said, taking his hand. "I am right here." "I need you to promise me something," Jamie said, and she could see the effort it cost him to speak. "Promise me you will keep playing, keep making music. It was the first thing I loved about you, and I cannot bear the thought of it stopping." "I promise," she whispered, tears streaming down her face, "but you are going to be fine. You are going to get better, and we are going to celebrate our 50th anniversary, and you are going to dance with me one more time." "I wish that were true," Jamie said gently. "But we both know it is not, and that is all right, Rosalie. We have had 50 years together. 50 years of love and laughter and a life beyond anything I ever dreamed possible. That is more than most people ever get. I am grateful for every single day." "I am not ready to let you go," Rosalie sobbed, pressing his hand to her cheek. "I do not know how to be in this world without you." "Yes, you do," Jamie said. "You are the strongest person I have ever known. You survived losing your father, and you survived all the challenges we faced together, and you will survive this too. And you will not be alone. You have our children, our grandchildren, all the people we have loved and who love you. You have your music. You will be all right." He closed his eyes then, his breathing shallow and labored, and Rosalie sat with him through the night, holding his hand and memorizing every detail of his face. Just before dawn, as the first light was beginning to creep through the windows, his breathing changed. Rosalie felt it, felt the moment he slipped away from her, and she cried out in anguish and grief. Their children came, summoned by her cries, and they surrounded her with love and support. But nothing could fill the terrible emptiness that Jamie's death had left behind. They buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a view of the mountains he had loved, and half the county came to pay their respects. Rosalie stood at the graveside, supported by Thomas on one side and Margaret on the other, and she thought she might never feel whole again. The weeks and months after Jamie's death were the hardest of Rosalie's life, harder even than losing her father had been. She had spent nearly 50 years with Jamie at her side, and without him, the world felt colorless and flat. She went through the motions of living, but there was no joy in it. She could not bring herself to play her fiddle, could not bear to touch the instrument that had brought them together, because every note reminded her of what she had lost. It was Sarah who finally broke through her grief. Her youngest daughter came to visit one afternoon in late winter, bringing her own children with her, and she found Rosalie sitting in the parlor, staring at nothing. Sarah sent the children outside to play and sat down beside her mother. "Mama," she said gently, "you are breaking your promise to Papa." Rosalie looked at her daughter, confused. "What do you mean?" "He made you promise to keep playing," Sarah said. "He made you promise not to let the music stop, but you have not touched your fiddle since the funeral. That was 6 months ago." "I cannot," Rosalie whispered. "Every time I even think about it, I start crying. The music was ours, his and mine, and without him it just feels wrong." "The music was yours first," Sarah pointed out. "You were playing that night in the dance hall before Papa ever walked in." "The music is part of who you are, Mama, not just part of your marriage. And Papa would not want you to give it up because he is gone. He would want you to play in his memory to celebrate the life you had together." Rosalie sat very still, letting her daughter's words sink in. She thought about that night in the dance hall, about playing alone with tears on her cheeks. She thought about all the times over the years when her fiddle had been a source of comfort and joy, not just for her but for everyone who heard it. She thought about Jamie's face when he listened to her play, the way his eyes would soften and his whole expression would relax. Slowly, she stood and walked to the corner where her fiddle case sat, gathering dust. She opened it with trembling hands and lifted out the instrument Jamie had given her on their 20th anniversary. It was beautiful, the wood glowing in the winter light, and as she settled it under her chin and drew the bow across the strings, she felt something inside her chest unlock. She played a hymn, Amazing Grace, the same song she had played at Samuel and Mary Beth's wedding all those years ago. Her fingers were stiff from lack of practice, and there were tears running down her face, but she played through it, letting the music wash over her and through her. And when she finished, she realized that Sarah was crying too, and from outside she could hear her grandchildren had stopped playing and were listening. "Thank you," she said to her daughter. "Thank you for reminding me." After that, Rosalie began to heal. It was a slow process, and there were still days when the grief threatened to overwhelm her, but she kept playing. She played at church services and family gatherings. She taught her grandchildren the songs her father had taught her, and her father's father before him, keeping the music alive across generations. She played alone on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the ranch that she and Jamie had built, and she felt his presence in the notes and the melodies. In 1935, on what would have been their 50th anniversary, Rosalie organized a concert at the community center. She played for 2 hours straight, every song that had been meaningful to her and Jamie. At the end, she stood before the crowded room and spoke about her husband, about the cowboy who had walked into a dance hall and asked her to play at his friend's wedding, never imagining that he was really asking for a lifetime. "Music brought us together," she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her face. "And music sustains me now that he is gone. It is my connection to him, to my father, to everyone I have loved and lost, and it is my gift to all of you, to the community that has been my home for my entire life. Thank you for allowing me to share it with you." The applause was thunderous, and people were standing and crying and calling out their love for her. Rosalie stood there taking it in, feeling wrapped in the warmth of community and connection, and she knew that Jamie would have been proud. She lived for another 10 years, dying peacefully in her sleep in 1945 at the age of 80. Her children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren, were there in the last weeks, filling the house with life and laughter and love. She spent her final days in the parlor where Jamie had died, surrounded by photographs and memories, and she played her fiddle almost to the very end. On her last day, Margaret brought her own fiddle and played a duet with her mother, the two instruments singing together in perfect harmony. When the song ended, Rosalie handed her fiddle to Margaret with a smile. "Keep it in the family," she said. "Keep the music alive, that is all I ask." "I will, Mama," Margaret promised. "We all will." That night, Rosalie dreamed of Jamie. He was young again, the handsome cowboy with blue eyes and a warm smile who had walked into the dance hall so many years ago. He held out his hand to her, and she took it, feeling young herself again, feeling whole and complete. They danced together under a sky full of stars, and somewhere in the distance, a fiddle was playing. When her children came to wake her the next morning, they found her with a peaceful expression on her face, as though she had gone gladly to wherever waited beyond. They buried her beside Jamie on the hill overlooking the ranch, and at her funeral, Margaret played the fiddle while 3 generations of her family sang the old hymns she had loved. The ranch stayed in the family for generations after that, passed down from parent to child, and there was always someone who played the fiddle, keeping Rosalie's promise alive. The instrument Jamie had given her on their 20th anniversary was carefully preserved, brought out for special occasions, and played by those who had inherited her gift for music. And every time someone picked it up and drew the bow across the strings, they remembered the story of the woman who had been playing alone in a dance hall, and the cowboy who had asked her to play at a wedding, never knowing he was really asking for forever. In Silver Ridge, which had grown from a rough frontier town into a prosperous community, there was a plaque in the community center that read, "In memory of Rosalie and Jamie Thornton, whose love story began with music and whose legacy continues to inspire us all." And on summer evenings, when the wind blew down from the mountains and the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, people would sometimes swear they could hear the faint sound of a fiddle playing, sweet and pure and full of joy. Their story became legend, told and retold around dinner tables and campfires, embellished and romanticized but always fundamentally true. The woman playing fiddle alone in the dance hall, the cowboy who walked in and heard his future in her music. The wedding that brought them together and the lifetime of love that followed. The ranch they built with their own hands, the children they raised, the community they helped create. It was the kind of story that reminded people what was possible when 2 hearts found each other against all odds. And somewhere beyond the veil of mortality, perhaps Rosalie and Jamie danced on, young and in love and eternally together, while the music played and the stars wheeled overhead, and time lost all meaning in the face of a love that had transcended death itself. Their children thrived, their grandchildren prospered, their great-grandchildren carried on the traditions they had established. The ranch remained productive and profitable, a testament to hard work and careful stewardship. The fiddle passed from generation to generation, each player adding their own style while honoring the foundation that Rosalie had established. On the 100th anniversary of their wedding, in 1985, the family organized a massive reunion. Over 200 descendants gathered at the ranch, now a sprawling operation that encompassed several thousand acres. They roasted whole steers and pigs, and there was dancing and music and storytelling that went on for 3 days. Margaret's granddaughter, herself named Rosalie, played the original fiddle, and the notes rang out clear and true across the valley, carried on the wind to the hill where their ancestors lay buried. Standing at that graveside, looking at the markers for Rosalie and Jamie Thornton, the younger generation felt a connection to the past that was almost tangible. These were real people who had lived and loved and struggled and triumphed. They were not abstract historical figures but flesh and blood ancestors, who had made choices and sacrifices that had shaped the lives of everyone who came after them. The story was told again that night, as it had been told countless times before. How Rosalie had been playing alone in the dance hall, lost in her grief after her father's death, pouring her heart into the music because she had nothing else. How Jamie had walked in and been transfixed, seeing beyond her loneliness to the extraordinary woman beneath. How he had asked her to play at a wedding, giving them both an excuse to spend time together, to explore the connection that had sparked between them from the very first moment. How that wedding had led to their own, and how their marriage had become the foundation for everything that came after. It was a love story for the ages, the kind that reminded people why they believed in romance and commitment and the possibility of happily ever after. It was also a story about resilience and courage, about two people who had faced challenges and hardships but had never given up on each other or on the life they were building together. It was about the transformative power of love, yes, but also about the importance of hard work and dedication, and never losing sight of what truly mattered. As the sun set on that 100th anniversary celebration, the family gathered on the hill where Rosalie and Jamie were buried. Someone started singing Amazing Grace, and others joined in, their voices rising in harmony. And then young Rosalie lifted the fiddle and began to play, the notes soaring above the voices. And for a moment it was as though the past and present merged, as though Rosalie and Jamie themselves were there among their descendants, smiling and holding hands and watching their legacy unfold. The music played on into the twilight, and the stars began to appear, the same stars that had watched over a young couple building their dreams in the Montana Territory all those years ago. The ranch lay peaceful and beautiful in the gathering darkness, the buildings solid and well-maintained, the cattle grazing quietly in the fields, the next generation of Thorntons ready to carry the family forward into the future. And if you listened very carefully, beyond the music and the voices and the sounds of celebration, you might have heard something else. A whisper on the wind, a sigh of contentment, the echo of laughter from long ago. The spirits of Rosalie and Jamie, still together after all these years, still dancing to the music that had brought them together in a dance hall in Silver Ridge on a long-ago autumn night in 1884. Their love had not ended with death. It had merely transformed, becoming part of the very fabric of the land they had claimed and the family they had created. Every child born into the Thornton family carried a piece of them forward. Every note played on Rosalie's fiddle was an echo of the passion and joy she had felt. Every sunset viewed from the porch of the ranch house was a reminder of the countless evenings they had spent there together, planning and dreaming and simply being together. This was their legacy, their gift to the future. Not just land or wealth or material possessions, though those things had their place. But something far more valuable, the knowledge that love was real and lasting and worth fighting for. The understanding that a life built on partnership and mutual respect and genuine affection could withstand any challenge. The certainty that music and beauty and connection were not luxuries but necessities, the things that made life worth living. As the celebration finally wound down and people began to drift back to their cars and hotels, the young Rosalie carefully packed away the fiddle, handling it with the reverence it deserved. She thought about her great-great-grandmother, the woman she had been named for, and she felt a profound sense of gratitude. Because of Rosalie Crawford Thornton's courage and talent and willingness to take a chance on love, all of this existed. The family, the ranch, the music, the stories. It had all started with a woman playing fiddle alone in a dance hall and a cowboy brave enough to walk through the door. And that, in the end, was the real magic of it. Not that they had lived happily ever after, though they had, but that their happiness had multiplied and spread, touching generation after generation, creating ripples that would continue forward in time long after anyone who had known them personally was gone. Their love had become immortal, not in a mystical sense but in the very real impact it had on the world. The dance hall where they had met was long gone, torn down in the 1920s and replaced by a hardware store. The hotel where they had spent their wedding night had burned in a fire in 1935. The original ranch buildings had been replaced and modernized, but the hill where they were buried remained, a constant in a changing world, and their descendants continued to care for it, knowing it was sacred ground. In the years to come, more children would be born, more stories would be told, more music would be played. The Thornton family would continue to grow and evolve, adapting to new times while holding fast to the core values that Rosalie and Jamie had instilled. There would be challenges and setbacks, joys and triumphs, all the ordinary and extraordinary moments that made up a life well lived. But through it all, the memory of that first meeting would endure. The woman alone in the dance hall, playing her heart out on the fiddle. The cowboy who heard her music and recognized his destiny. The question that changed two lives, would she play at a wedding? The answer that set everything in motion. Yes, it was a simple story, really, stripped down to its essentials. Two people meeting, falling in love, building a life together. The same story that had played out millions of times throughout human history. But it was also entirely unique, because it was theirs, shaped by their personalities and choices, and the particular time and place in which they lived. And now, as the moon rose over the Montana mountains and the ranch settled into peaceful silence, that story was complete. Beginning, middle, and end, all accounted for. The circle closed, the promise fulfilled. The love that had started in a dance hall in 1884 finally laid to rest in 1945, and then immortalized through memory and music, and the many lives it had touched. Rosalie and Jamie Thornton had lived and loved and died, as all people must. But they had done so with grace and courage, and an unwavering commitment to each other and to the family they built. They had taken the raw materials of frontier life and transformed them into something beautiful and lasting. They had faced hardship without flinching and celebrated joy without reservation. They had been, in every way that mattered, partners in the truest sense of the word. Their happily ever after was not a fairy tale ending where nothing ever went wrong. It was the far more meaningful reality of two people who chose each other every single day, through good times and bad, until death parted them. And even then, even in death, their love continued, living on in their descendants and in the music that still played when someone picked up Rosalie's fiddle and drew the bow across the strings. This was their story. This was their legacy. And it all began with a cowboy walking into a dance hall and asking a woman playing fiddle if she would play at a wedding, never dreaming he was really asking her to play at their wedding, to play for their whole life together, to create a symphony of love that would echo through the generations long after the last note had faded into silence.